Copper Ridge was never meant to hold secrets. The land was too small, the people too nosy, the town too tightly stitched together for anyone to vanish without someone noticing. And yet, in the autumn of 1957, someone did, someone no one in Miller County would ever forget. Her name was Evelyn Buchanan, wife of Sheriff Harold Buchanan. Church choir alto. President of the Ladies' Auxiliary. A woman whose smile could stop a man mid-step on Main Street and whose peach cobbler had won the county fair 7 years in a row. She was the sheriff's anchor, and in many ways, the soul of the town itself. On a mild October evening, Evelyn kissed her husband goodbye, said she was going to visit her sister in Springfield, and drove off in her mint green Chevy Bel Air. She never arrived. Her car was found 2 days later at the edge of Copper Ridge, the passenger door ajar, a picnic basket overturned on the front seat. Inside the basket, a single glove, a half-eaten apple pie, and Evelyn's wedding ring, still warm, as if it had just slipped off her finger. No footprints. No signs of a struggle. No ransom note. No suspects. And no Evelyn. What happened that night would fracture a town and destroy a man. Sheriff Buchanan, the man sworn to uphold law and order, would spend the rest of his life chasing a ghost that smelled like honeysuckle and wore the same red lipstick Evelyn always did. Because some roads don't just swallow people. Some remember them. And Copper Ridge? Copper Ridge remembers everything. If you're ready to hear the story of how a sheriff lost the one person he couldn't protect, and how her death uncovered a darkness far deeper than any small-town scandal, then hit subscribe and stay with us. Because this isn't just a story about a disappearance. It's about how grief changes a town, and how love can still haunt the places where it died. Chapter 1, The Last Goodbye. October 12, 1957, began like any other Saturday in Miller County, with the smell of frying bacon on kitchen stoves, the sound of screen doors slamming shut, and the soft hum of radios tuned to KZMO for the morning farm report. Autumn had come gently to the Ozarks that year, laying a golden blanket of leaves over the hills and painting the valleys in shades of rust and flame. It was a day for yard sales, church picnics, and slow drives down County Road 7 with the windows rolled down. Inside a white clapboard house at the edge of town, Evelyn Buchanan stood in front of the mirror, buttoning her favorite floral dress. She was 41, though most people thought she looked younger. Maybe it was her complexion, still untouched by the years, or the way she carried herself, poised, graceful, the picture of Midwestern decency. Or maybe it was because Evelyn Buchanan had spent her whole life caring for others. People like that age differently. They wore their burdens quietly, like pearls around the neck. She hummed an old hymn as she pinned her hair into place and reached for her lipstick, Red Revival, the shade Harold always said made her look like she'd stepped out of a movie. He was still at the breakfast table, in uniform, sipping black coffee and scanning the morning edition of the Miller County Gazette. Sheriff Harold Buchanan was a man built of duty and routine, the kind who believed that if you worked hard and did right, the world would make sense. That belief would not survive the week. Heading out early, he asked without looking up. "Ruth's got a new baby," Evelyn said, fastening the clasp on her pearl earrings. "I told her I'd bring pie and help with the laundry. Maybe stay the night if she needs the rest." Harold nodded, though she hadn't asked for permission. That was one of the quiet strengths of their marriage, she never asked, and he never needed her to. He folded the paper and looked at her then, really looked at her. "You'll be careful driving over the ridge?" "I always am." The ridge, Copper Ridge, was nothing more than a long, looping stretch of elevated road carved through the oldest part of the hills. It was beautiful in autumn, when the trees arched overhead in a cathedral of crimson and gold. But locals swore the ridge had moods. On still nights, you could hear sounds that didn't belong, footsteps in the woods, whispers in the wind. Some said the ridge was cursed, though no one could remember why. Evelyn didn't believe in curses. She believed in casseroles and Sunday service and the goodness of people. So she kissed Harold on the cheek, promised to call when she arrived, and left the house with a smile. The last image he had of her was through the kitchen window, Evelyn backing the mint green Chevy Bel Air out of the gravel driveway, the morning sun catching the shine of her hair. She waved. He waved back. And then she was gone, swallowed by the rising hills and winding roads of Miller County. She was last seen at Harlow's General Store at 11:42 a.m., buying flour, sugar, and a tin of coffee. Mrs. Harlow said Evelyn seemed cheerful as ever, even humming under her breath as she waited for change. At 12:17 p.m., a farmer named Clyde Jenkins spotted her car heading east on Copper Ridge Road. He remembered it because of the church decal on the rear bumper, First Baptist Ladies Auxiliary. After that, the trail vanished. When Ruth called Harold at 5:30 to ask why Evelyn hadn't arrived, he felt the first stirrings of unease. By 7 o'clock, unease had turned to worry. By midnight, worry had hardened into something colder, heavier, a sheriff's instinct honed by decades on the job. He drove the route she would have taken. Twice. He stopped at every gas station, every diner, every roadside turnout. No one had seen her. It was as if Evelyn Buchanan had evaporated into the autumn air. At 3:14 a.m., Deputy Raymond Cook radioed in. His voice was trembling. "Sheriff, I think we found her car." It was parked on the eastern overlook of Copper Ridge, nose angled toward the valley, headlights dead. The passenger door hung open. On the front seat, a picnic basket lay tipped on its side, its contents spilled, a folded dish towel, a half-eaten apple pie, a single glove. And inside that glove, nestled neatly in the palm, was Evelyn's wedding ring. The ground around the car was undisturbed. No footprints. No drag marks. No tire impressions but her own. It was as if she had stepped out of the vehicle, removed her ring, and vanished into the void. Sheriff Buchanan stood there for a long time, the wind cutting cold through his uniform, the trees whispering above him. He'd seen accidents, suicides, murders. He'd stared down men who thought they could hide their sins from the law. But this was something else. Something colder. Something that didn't make sense. The sun rose over Copper Ridge that morning, painting the sky in soft pink and gold, but Harold Buchanan felt none of its warmth. The woman he loved was gone. The ridge had taken her. And deep down, in the place he'd never admit aloud, he knew the ridge wouldn't give her back. Chapter 2, The Search Begins. Dawn came reluctantly over Copper Ridge on October 13, 1957, a thin, pale light that struggled to push through the heavy mist blanketing the valley. The sun rose, but the town did not stir with its usual rhythm. Church bells still rang. Roosters still crowed. But there was something different in the air, something heavier. The sheriff's wife was missing, and in Miller County, that meant the world had slipped off its axis. By 7 a.m., Sheriff Harold Buchanan had turned the station into a command post. Deputies crowded around maps spread across the conference table, marking grids and assigning search zones. State police were on their way from Jefferson City. Even the highway patrol had offered air support, though the sheriff declined. There was too much canopy for helicopters to be useful. What struck everyone immediately was how little there was to go on. The Chevy Bel Air had been found intact, no sign of forced entry, no blood, no fingerprints except Evelyn's. The keys were still in the ignition. The gas tank was half full. The passenger door was open, as if she'd simply stepped out. But stepped out where? Deputy Cook returned to the overlook at first light with a team of bloodhounds. The dogs circled the car, sniffed the picnic basket, and then, nothing. They whined, tugged at their leashes, and sat down. One of them barked at the treeline and refused to move forward. It was the same behavior the dogs had shown years earlier when searching for a missing boy on the other side of the ridge, a case that had never been solved. "Animals pick up on things we can't," Cook muttered under his breath. Harold didn't respond. He'd stopped believing in coincidences long ago. By mid-morning, more than 100 volunteers had gathered at the base of the ridge. They were farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, men and women who had known Evelyn all their lives. They formed search lines and moved slowly through the underbrush, calling her name, combing every inch of ground. They found a pair of tire tracks leading off the main road, but they belonged to a county maintenance truck. They found a red scarf tangled in a bush, but it wasn't Evelyn's. They found deer tracks, raccoon tracks, and the remains of a fox, but no sign of a human being. By noon, frustration set in. By sunset, dread had taken its place. The town of Camdenton had never seen anything like it. Evelyn wasn't some transient passing through or a teenager running away. She was a pillar of the community, the woman who organized the bake sales, chaired the charity drives, sent casseroles when someone died. She was the sheriff's wife. And people like her didn't just vanish. The local newspaper, the Miller County Gazette, ran the headline that afternoon. Sheriff's wife missing, mystery deepens on Copper Ridge. Reporters from St. Louis and Kansas City descended on the town within 48 hours. They filmed the overlook. They interviewed Harold on camera, his face drawn and hollow, the brim of his hat pulled low to hide the exhaustion in his eyes. They asked if he suspected foul play. "I don't suspect anything," he said quietly. "I know something's wrong." But what was wrong? Harold interviewed every driver who had passed through Copper Ridge that day. Most had seen nothing unusual, a deer crossing, a squirrel darting across the road, nothing else. One truck driver swore he'd seen a woman in a light-colored dress walking along the ridge near dusk, but when pressed for details, his story shifted. Another witness said he'd seen a green car parked at the overlook, but couldn't remember the license plate, the make, or the time. The sheriff even questioned Ruth, Evelyn's sister, hoping for some clue. Did she mention anyone bothering her? Anyone following her? Ruth shook her head. No. She was excited to see the baby. She baked that pie just for me. Harold, she was happy. Happy. And gone. On the third day, searchers expanded the perimeter beyond Copper Ridge. They dragged creeks, sifted through abandoned barns, and opened root cellars that hadn't been touched in decades. Nothing. It was as if Evelyn Buchanan had stepped off the face of the earth. And then came the first lead. A local teenager named Mason Carter claimed he'd been hunting squirrels near Copper Ridge on the afternoon of the disappearance. Around 5 p.m., he said, he'd heard a woman screaming. It wasn't the kind of scream you mistake for an animal, it was sharp, desperate, human. When he ran toward the sound, it stopped. The woods were silent. Too silent. Deputy Cook dismissed it as imagination, but Harold wasn't so sure. Mason's story echoed something he'd heard before. In 1942, a young couple had vanished near the same stretch of road. A hunter had reported hearing screams in the woods that day, too. No bodies were ever found. The sheriff ordered another sweep of the ridge. They combed the woods again, this time with cadaver dogs. The dogs reacted near an old logging trail about half a mile from where Evelyn's car had been found. They barked and pawed at the ground but turned back whimpering before they could advance deeper into the woods. The handler swore he'd never seen them behave like that. By the end of the first week, the official investigation had turned into something else, an obsession. Harold stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. He drove the ridge every night, spotlight sweeping the treeline, searching for a flash of fabric, a glint of jewelry, anything. He walked through the woods alone, calling her name long after the search parties had gone home. "Evelyn," he shouted into the darkness one night. "If you can hear me, answer me." Only the wind replied, threading through the trees with a sound like whispered laughter. The town began to change. People locked their doors for the first time in decades. Children were no longer allowed to walk home from school alone. The once idyllic valley felt smaller now, as if the hills themselves were closing in. And though no one said it aloud, a question began to ripple through Miller County like a cold current. If the sheriff's wife could vanish without a trace, was anyone safe? Harold told himself that answers were coming, that evidence would surface, that someone would slip, that the truth would reveal itself. But deep in his bones, a darker thought took root. What if there was nothing to find? What if the ridge had taken her in a way the law could never understand? The investigation would continue. The search would go on. But Copper Ridge wasn't finished with its secrets. And before it was done, it would reveal something far more disturbing than a simple disappearance. Chapter 3: The Suspects. By the second week of the investigation, Miller County had stopped whispering and started speculating. Everyone had a theory about what happened to Evelyn Buchanan, and none of them agreed. In a place where gossip was currency, the disappearance of the sheriff's wife was the closest thing to gold. The first theory, and the one Harold hated most, was the simplest: she'd run away. Some people, mostly those who didn't know her, whispered that maybe Evelyn had been unhappy. That maybe the perfect marriage wasn't so perfect behind closed doors. They pointed to her leaving her wedding ring behind as evidence. They said she'd fallen in love with someone else, planned her escape, staged the scene to look like an abduction. Harold shut those rumors down fast. Evelyn wasn't the type to run from anything, least of all him. Their marriage wasn't perfect, whose was? But it was real. Solid. Built on 2 decades of love, patience, and shared grief after losing their first child. Evelyn didn't vanish because she wanted to. Someone took her. The second theory was darker: revenge. Harold had worn the badge for nearly 25 years. He'd put away bootleggers, bank robbers, and more than a few men who swore they'd make him pay for it one day. Maybe one of them had come back. Maybe they couldn't get to him, so they took the person he loved most. It was plausible, too plausible, and Harold followed that lead with grim determination. He made a list of every man he'd arrested in the last decade and started working down the names. Deputies checked alibis. State police pulled files. One by one, the names were crossed off. Dead. Still in prison. Out of state. Wrong age. Wrong motive. Still, a few stood out. There was Clifford Hayes, a drifter Harold had arrested 3 years earlier for assaulting a waitress at the Rusty Nail Tavern. Hayes had served his time and vanished after release, but a bartender in Jefferson City swore he'd seen him near Miller County 2 weeks before Evelyn disappeared. Harold sent deputies to track him down, but Hayes was gone, no forwarding address, no known associates, nothing. Then there was Virgil Boone, a moonshiner Harold had busted twice in the late 40s. Boone had sworn revenge as he was led away in handcuffs. He'd been released from state prison 6 months earlier. When questioned, Boone claimed he'd turned over a new leaf and was working on a farm in Kansas. His employer confirmed his alibi. The leads led nowhere. Every theory crumbled under scrutiny. But then a new name surfaced, one Harold had never expected to see on a suspect list. Dr. Arthur Pennington. Town physician. Respected, soft-spoken, always ready with a house call and a kind word. He'd treated Evelyn for years. Harold knew him well. They'd shared drinks at Rotary Club meetings, hunted deer together in the fall. And yet, more than one person mentioned seeing Pennington's car parked outside the Buchanan home on nights when Harold was working late. At first, Harold dismissed it as coincidence. Pennington often made house calls, and Evelyn had suffered from migraines for years. But when Deputy Cook told him that Pennington had abruptly canceled his appointments and left town the morning after Evelyn vanished, Harold's pulse quickened. It was a lead, and the first one that made his stomach twist. They found Pennington 3 days later in Little Rock, staying at a motel under a false name. He claimed he'd gone there to visit his sister, but she hadn't seen him in months. Under questioning, Pennington grew agitated. He denied any affair with Evelyn but admitted they were close. "She was a friend," he said. "She confided in me. That's all." "What did she confide?" Harold asked. Pennington hesitated. That she was unhappy. The room fell silent. Harold's jaw tightened. Unhappy how? She didn't say. Just that she felt trapped. Like something was closing in on her. She'd started having strange dreams, nightmares, really, about the ridge. Said she'd see faces in the trees when she drove over it. Hear voices when she was alone. Voices. Faces. Harold felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Evelyn had never told him any of that. When pressed, Pennington admitted one more thing: she had canceled her appointment the day before she disappeared, saying she had something important to do. She didn't elaborate. The sheriff had Pennington's car searched top to bottom. They found nothing: no fibers, no blood, no trace of Evelyn. Without evidence, they couldn't hold him. He returned to Miller County under a cloud of suspicion and shuttered his practice within a month. The investigation turned inward after that. Harold questioned Evelyn's closest friends, searching for anything: a secret, a fight, a hint of despair. He learned things he wished he hadn't. That Evelyn had been writing letters she never mailed. That she sometimes drove Copper Ridge alone late at night, parking at the overlook for hours. That she'd once told a friend she felt watched in her own home. None of it made sense. Evelyn wasn't paranoid. She wasn't delusional. And yet, piece by piece, a picture was forming, one Harold didn't recognize. A woman with fears she'd never voiced. A woman who'd been carrying something heavy and silent. A woman who might have known more than she ever let on. By the end of October, the investigation had exhausted every conventional lead. There was no sign of foul play. No evidence of abduction. No ransom demands. No credible sightings. Just a car, an open door, a wedding ring, and a void where Evelyn should have been. But Harold couldn't let it go. He couldn't accept that the trail had gone cold. Because there was one fact he couldn't ignore. Evelyn wasn't the first person to disappear on Copper Ridge. In 1933, a trapper vanished near the same overlook. His rifle was found propped against a tree, still loaded. In 1942, a young couple disappeared on their wedding day. Their car was parked in almost the exact same spot as Evelyn's. And in 1951, a hitchhiker was last seen walking toward the ridge. His boots were later found neatly placed side by side on the shoulder of the road. 3 disappearances. All unsolved. All within a quarter-mile of where Evelyn's car had been discovered. The sheriff stared at the map late one night, the dots marking those cases glowing like a constellation. It wasn't random. It couldn't be. Something tied them together. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't an affair. It wasn't an accident. Whatever had taken Evelyn, whatever had taken them all, had been there long before she vanished. And Harold Buchanan, for the first time in his career, began to wonder if the answers he was looking for were buried deeper than the law could reach. Chapter 4: The Ridge Remembers. By November 1957, the case had shifted from investigation to obsession. The town moved on, as towns always do, but Sheriff Harold Buchanan could not. He spent his days questioning the same witnesses, combing the same patch of woods, reading the same case files until the words blurred on the page. Every night he returned to Copper Ridge, sitting in his patrol car beneath the skeletal trees, staring at the spot where Evelyn's car had been found. It was as if the ridge itself was mocking him. But if the present held no answers, maybe the past did. Harold began digging, not into evidence, but into history. He started with land records, county deeds, church registries, newspaper clippings from decades past. What he found was stranger, and more unsettling, than anything he had anticipated. The name Copper Ridge dated back to the 1850s, when settlers from Kentucky and Tennessee carved farms into the hillsides. The ridge was named for the reddish soil that stained boots and wagon wheels alike, a soil the Osage people, who'd lived there for centuries, called Blood Earth. They had warned early settlers not to build there. The land, they said, was cursed, hungry, and would take more than it gave. The warnings were dismissed, as they always were. The first settlers vanished in 1858. A family of 5, the Harpers, disappeared from their homestead without a trace. Their supper was still on the table. Their tools lay scattered in the fields. Their livestock wandered free in the woods. Search parties combed the ridge for weeks and found nothing. No bodies. No signs of violence. Only one thing remained: 5 sets of boots, neatly lined up on the front porch. It became the first entry in what locals would later call the Ridge Ledger, a list of disappearances stretching back more than a century. Hunters. Trappers. Travelers. Entire families. All gone. All without explanation. In 1891, a small mining company purchased land on the ridge and began digging for copper. The mine closed 6 months later after 3 workers vanished underground. Their tools were discovered deep in the tunnel, but there was no sign of the men. The company sealed the mine entrance and left. It was never reopened. In 1914, a church was built near the overlook. It burned to the ground less than a year later. Witnesses swore they saw figures moving inside the flames, shapes that didn't move like people. The pastor who rebuilt it hanged himself 3 weeks after the dedication, leaving a note that read, "It won't let me sleep. It won't let me leave." Every decade, the ridge took something. A person. A group. A piece of someone's mind. And every time, the land swallowed the evidence whole. Harold showed his findings to Deputy Cook one cold November night. The deputy stared at the stack of clippings and shook his head. "You're chasing ghosts," he said. "Maybe," Harold replied. "But ghosts don't steal people off the face of the earth." Cook sighed. "Sheriff, you're starting to sound like those old-timers at the barber shop. Next thing you'll tell me is the ridge is haunted." But Harold wasn't laughing. "What if it is?" Cook stared at him. "You're not serious." "I've been a lawman for 25 years, Harold said. "I've seen what men are capable of. But this isn't that. Evelyn didn't run away. She wasn't kidnapped for ransom. There's no evidence, no motive, no reason. It's like she was taken." "Taken by what?" "I don't know," Harold admitted. "But whatever it is, it's been here a long time." The sheriff's research led him deeper into the archives, into journals, letters, and oral histories long forgotten. One account, written in 1882 by a homesteader named Jacob Muir, stopped him cold. "The ridge watches. It breathes. It hums beneath the ground like something dreaming. I have seen shapes in the fog, tall, thin things with no eyes. They stand among the trees and sway, as if listening. And when they turn toward you, you cannot move. You cannot breathe. They do not kill you. They take you into the ground. They take you into themselves." Muir vanished 2 weeks after writing that entry. His wife and 3 children disappeared the same night. Their house was found empty, doors unlocked, fire still burning in the hearth. The more Harold read, the clearer the pattern became. The disappearances weren't random. They followed cycles, 13 years apart, always in autumn, always near the new moon. The ridge was patient. It waited. It watched. And then it took. The sheriff mapped the dates and locations of every known disappearance and overlaid them on a modern map. His heart nearly stopped. Every single case, every vanishing, every mystery, formed a perfect spiral centered around the overlook where Evelyn's car had been found. It was no coincidence. It was design. One night, unable to sleep, Harold drove to the overlook alone. A thick fog rolled in as he parked his cruiser, the kind that swallowed sound and blurred the line between road and sky. He stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel, and walked to the edge of the ridge. "Evelyn," he whispered into the darkness. The wind answered. It carried a sound so faint he almost dismissed it. A woman's voice. Singing. Soft and distant. A lullaby Evelyn used to hum while doing the dishes. Harold's breath caught. "Evelyn?" The singing stopped. Silence. And then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere deep in the fog. Harold raised his flashlight and swept it across the trees. Nothing. But the footsteps continued, closer now, circling him. Then they stopped. For a heartbeat, the night was utterly still. And then, from just beyond the reach of his light, a voice, her voice, whispered his name. "Harold." He spun toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Only darkness. Only the ridge. The sheriff left Copper Ridge that night with his heart pounding and his mind in chaos. Had he imagined it? Was it grief? Exhaustion? Or was the ridge trying to show him something, or someone? The next morning, he told no one about what he'd heard. Not Cook. Not the state investigators. Not even Margaret, Evelyn's sister. Some truths were too fragile to share. But from that night on, one thought took root in his mind, a thought more terrible than any he'd had before. What if Evelyn was still out there? What if she wasn't gone at all, just somewhere else? The ridge wasn't just a place. It was a pattern. A hunger. A wound that refused to heal. And for the first time, Harold Buchanan understood why the old records all said the same thing. The ridge remembers. It remembers every footstep, every breath, every life it's ever taken. And it was far from finished. Chapter 5, The Discovery. The winter of 1957 came early to Miller County. By the first week of December, frost clung stubbornly to the trees along Copper Ridge, and the nights had grown long and bitter. Most of the search parties had disbanded by then. The volunteers had families to feed and farms to run. The state investigators had moved on to fresher cases. Even the newspapers had shifted their focus, printing smaller and smaller updates on the disappearance of Evelyn Buchanan until they stopped mentioning her altogether. But Sheriff Harold Buchanan hadn't stopped. He couldn't. Each night he returned to that same patch of road, walking the shoulder with his flashlight, combing the ditches and thickets for something, anything, the others might have missed. He knew people in town were talking. They said he'd lost his mind. That he was chasing ghosts. That he was letting the rest of the county slip into chaos while he obsessed over a woman who wasn't coming back. They were wrong. He wasn't chasing ghosts. He was chasing Evelyn. It was a cold Tuesday morning when a call came into the sheriff's office that stopped Harold mid-breath. A hunter named Calvin Dorsey had been tracking deer through the woods north of Copper Ridge when his dog started barking at something buried beneath a tangle of brush. At first, Dorsey thought it was the carcass of a buck. Then he saw the fabric. A torn scrap of floral cloth, the same print Evelyn had been wearing the day she vanished. By the time Harold arrived, the ground was already marked off and deputies were combing the area with shovels and gloved hands. They unearthed more fabric. Then a shoe. And then bones. Human bones. The clearing was small, no more than a shallow depression in the earth, but what they found there was enough to turn the investigation on its head. The remains were scattered, as if something had dragged them there piece by piece. The skull was missing. Several ribs were splintered as though crushed by tremendous force. And clinging to one of the bones, fused into it like it had grown there, was a thin, fibrous root. It pulsed slightly when touched. Animals, one of the deputies said, his voice unsteady. Probably animals dragged her out here. Harold stared at the root. It twitched again, almost imperceptibly. Animals don't do that, he muttered. The coroner later confirmed the remains were human, female, approximately 40 to 45, consistent with Evelyn's height and weight. But he couldn't determine a cause of death. There were no signs of stabbing, no bullet wounds, no blunt force trauma. In fact, the bones looked as if they had softened, as though something had broken them down from the inside. More disturbing still was the timeline. The tissue samples suggested the remains had been there for months, possibly years. That was impossible. Evelyn had vanished only 8 weeks earlier. How can bones be that old? Harold demanded. The coroner shook his head. I've never seen anything like it. The discovery should have brought closure. Instead, it opened a deeper wound. The remains answered one question: Evelyn was dead, but they raised 100 more. How had her body ended up so far from the overlook? What had happened to the rest of her remains? And why did the evidence defy everything science could explain? Word of the find spread through Miller County like wildfire. Townsfolk gathered outside the sheriff's office, clutching newspapers and whispering prayers. The ladies' auxiliary held a candlelight vigil on the courthouse steps. And though Harold was grateful for their support, part of him hated it. Because in their eyes, the case was over. Evelyn was gone. It was time to mourn. But Harold knew better. The case wasn't over, it had only just begun. He returned to the site a dozen times over the next 2 weeks. Each time, he found something new, a piece of torn fabric here, a small bone there, always scattered, always in places that suggested movement. It was as if Evelyn's body hadn't simply decomposed. It had traveled. Deputy Cook urged him to let it go. "She's gone, Sheriff. You need to make peace with that." "Peace?" Harold said, his voice barely more than a growl. "How do you make peace with something like this?" Cook hesitated. "What if she wasn't killed?" Harold looked up sharply. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, what if the ridge changed her? What if whatever's out there didn't just take her, what if it used her?" It was an absurd idea. Ridiculous. And yet, Harold couldn't shake it. The fibrous roots. The impossible decomposition. The way the forest seemed to breathe around the clearing. It didn't feel like a grave. It felt like a nursery. A week before Christmas, another clue surfaced, one that chilled Harold to his core. A surveyor working near the base of the ridge uncovered an object buried less than a foot below the surface. It was a gold locket, tarnished but intact. Inside was a faded photograph of Harold and Evelyn on their wedding day. Engraved on the back were 3 words in Evelyn's handwriting, "Always come back." Harold stared at the locket for a long time. He couldn't remember her ever wearing it. And yet here it was, buried deep in the woods miles from where she vanished. The find reignited his obsession. He spent Christmas Eve on the ridge, flashlight in hand, searching for more. Snow fell softly through the pines, blanketing the earth in silence. And then, just after midnight, he found it, a trail of small depressions in the snow, too irregular to be animal tracks, too deliberate to be random. They led deeper into the forest, winding through the trees before disappearing into a dense thicket. Harold followed them without hesitation. The forest was deathly still. No wind. No rustle of branches. Just the crunch of his boots and the thud of his heartbeat. The tracks stopped abruptly in a clearing. And there, at the center of the clearing, was a tree, an enormous, ancient oak with a hollow at its base. Inside the hollow, something glimmered. Harold knelt and reached in. His fingers closed around something cold and metallic. When he pulled it out, his breath caught. It was Evelyn's wristwatch. Still ticking. That night, Harold stood beneath the black canopy of trees and felt the weight of something vast and incomprehensible pressing in on him. This was no ordinary crime. It was older. Deeper. Something that didn't care about evidence or procedure or human understanding. The ridge had not just taken Evelyn. It had claimed her. And if the watch was still ticking, Harold feared that, in some unfathomable way, she might still be out there. Not alive. Not dead. But becoming something else. The discovery changed everything. Evelyn Buchanan was no longer a missing person or even a victim. She was part of whatever lived beneath Copper Ridge. And now Harold had only one purpose left, to find out what that was, and if it could still be stopped. Chapter 6, The Final Revelation. By the time the first thaw touched Copper Ridge in March 1958, Sheriff Harold Buchanan was no longer the same man who had once worn the badge with pride and certainty. He looked older, thinner, and hollowed out, like a tree struck by lightning that still stood upright but was empty inside. Yet the fire that had driven him since Evelyn vanished still burned. He had sworn to find the truth, and that promise refused to die. The discovery of her remains, or what was left of them, had shaken the town. But to Harold, it was only a fragment of the story. The strange decomposition, the impossible timeline, the locket buried deep in the earth, they weren't random details. They were breadcrumbs, and he believed they were leading him towards something bigger. He began working with Professor Leonard Graves, a retired anthropologist from the University of Missouri who had spent years studying native Osage oral traditions. Graves was skeptical at first, he had no interest in wild ghost stories or small-town hysteria. But when Harold showed him the evidence, the root fused to Evelyn's bone, the spiral pattern of disappearances, the translated Osage word for blood earth, the professor's skepticism began to waver. "There are stories," Graves said, poring over Burl manuscripts in his study. "Old stories. Not about ghosts or spirits, but about something older. Something that lives beneath the land itself. They called it Ataka, which roughly translates to that which hungers. It wasn't a demon. It wasn't a god. It was a force. They believed the earth itself could become aware, and in certain places where blood had been spilled again and again, it would awaken." Harold listened, skeptical but desperate. "And what does it do?" Graves hesitated. "It feeds." The professor's research traced Ataka legends across centuries, accounts of settlements abandoned overnight, forests that ate travelers whole, and places where time seemed to distort and memories unraveled. In every case, the pattern was the same. First came disappearances. Then came the whispers. Then, eventually, came the transformation. Transformation into what? Harold asked. Graves looked at him gravely. Into itself. The stories say that once Ataka touches you, you don't die, not in the way we understand it. You become part of the land. Part of the hunger. Harold thought of the fibrous roots wrapped around Evelyn's bones. He thought of the watch still ticking inside the hollow tree. He thought of the strange, deliberate way her remains had been scattered, as if the ridge had been reclaiming them. "Are you telling me," he said slowly, "that Evelyn's becoming part of Copper Ridge?" Graves didn't answer. He didn't have to. The final breakthrough came not from science, but from chance. In late March, two boys exploring an abandoned mine shaft near the base of the ridge stumbled upon something buried beneath a thin layer of soil. It was a human skull, perfectly preserved, its eye sockets filled with a fibrous material that resembled dried roots. Dental records confirmed what Harold already knew in his bones: it was Evelyn's. But what chilled him wasn't the skull. It was what lay beneath it. Carved into the stone walls of the shaft were symbols, the same symbols that Union soldiers had reported seeing in 1862 when the original settlement vanished. Spirals. Arcs. Lines that twisted in ways that hurt to look at, that seemed to crawl across the rock even when his eyes were still. And in the center of those carvings, etched deeper than the rest, were words written in English. "She is not gone." The handwriting was Evelyn's. Harold didn't tell anyone about the inscription. He didn't show the photos. He didn't log the evidence. He drove home that night, locked himself in his study, and stared at the words until dawn. She is not gone. What did it mean? That she was alive? That part of her still existed somewhere beneath the soil? That she was speaking, through the ridge, through the earth itself? Or was it something worse, that the Evelyn he'd known and loved was gone, but something wearing her memory remained? Sleep eluded him. In the dead hours of the night, he swore he could hear her voice again, faint, distorted, rising from the soil beneath their yard. He would wake in a cold sweat, convinced someone had been whispering through the floorboards. "Harold," the voice would murmur. "Come home." He started driving the ridge again, not to search, but simply to be there. He'd park at the overlook, switch off the engine, and sit in the darkness for hours. Sometimes he'd hear singing in the distance. Sometimes he'd catch a glimpse of a pale shape moving between the trees. And once, just once, he swore he saw her. A figure in a floral dress, barefoot, hair tangled, standing at the edge of the tree line. She didn't move. She didn't speak. But he knew it was her. When he stepped out of the car and called her name, the figure dissolved into the mist. By spring, Harold had stopped calling it an investigation. It was a pilgrimage now, one he knew he would never complete. Copper Ridge had given him pieces of Evelyn, but not the whole. And in his heart, he knew it never would. In April 1958, the sheriff resigned. Officially, the report concluded that Evelyn Buchanan had been abducted and murdered by persons unknown. The case remained unsolved. But the townspeople whispered another version of the story, one about a place that takes people and never gives them back. A place where the land remembers. A place that hungers. Some said Harold moved away. Others said he stayed, wandering the woods at night, calling out a name that never answered. A few claimed they'd seen him talking to the trees. One man swore he saw the sheriff kneeling by the hollow oak where Evelyn's watch had been found, pressing his ear to the ground as if listening for a heartbeat beneath the soil. The official story ends there. But those who live near Copper Ridge know better. They know that every 13 years, when the new moon rises and the air turns cold, the ridge stirs again. They know that sometimes, if you're quiet and the wind is right, you can hear a woman's voice drifting through the pines, humming a lullaby that once echoed through a kitchen on a bright October morning. And if you listen long enough, you might hear something else. A deeper voice. Older. Hungrier. Whispering a single word over and over. More. Evelyn Buchanan's body was found, but the truth about her death was never written in any report. It wasn't murder. It wasn't madness. It was a message. The ridge does not kill. It does not forget. It remembers. And one day, it will feed again. Epilogue, the place that never lets go. Spring returned to Miller County like nothing had happened. The dogwoods bloomed pale and delicate along the roadside, the church bells rang on Sundays, and the children of Camdenton rode their bikes through the square as if the sheriff's wife had never existed. But Copper Ridge remained unchanged, a scar on the land that no season could heal. They buried what was left of Evelyn Buchanan in late April. The funeral was small. Closed casket. Margaret read a psalm. The choir sang softly. People brought casseroles and shook Harold's hand and said the kinds of things people say when words aren't enough. She's in a better place. At least you have closure. Time heals all wounds. But Harold knew time couldn't heal this one. Because the wound wasn't in his heart, it was in the earth itself. He left law enforcement and sold the house. No one blamed him. How could they? A man who couldn't protect his own wife had no business protecting anyone else. He moved into a small cabin miles from town, a place where he could wake to silence and forget the sound of her laughter. But forgetting never came. Evelyn lived in the corners of his memory, in the echo of every unanswered question. And Copper Ridge, that hateful, hungry ridge, lived there too. Some nights, Harold dreamed of her. Not as she was, but as she might be now, her skin pale as birch bark, her eyes hollow but aware, her fingers tangled in roots that pulsed beneath the soil. In those dreams she didn't speak, but he understood. She wasn't gone. She was part of something vast and ancient and still growing. The years went on. People stopped talking about the sheriff's wife. The case faded from memory, another unsolved tragedy in a long line of them. But every 13 years, the whispers returned. A hiker gone missing. A truck abandoned by the overlook. A set of footprints that led into the woods and never came out. And every time it happened, the locals said the same thing: the ridge is awake again. Today, the county maintains Copper Ridge Road. Tourists drive it for the view. Teenagers dare each other to park at the overlook after dark. And every so often, someone notices the same strange detail: how the wind dies down when you cross a certain bend, how the trees seem to lean closer, how the silence feels heavier. They say if you park your car on the shoulder, turn off the engine, and listen, really listen, you can hear a woman humming. Faint at first, like a memory on the edge of a dream. A lullaby. A song meant for someone who never came home. And if you stay too long, if you let the silence wrap itself around you, you might hear another sound, deeper, older, hungry. And then you'll understand what Sheriff Harold Buchanan learned too late. The ridge doesn't kill. It absorbs. It becomes. And once it has taken something, or someone, it never lets go. People will tell you Copper Ridge is just a road. A stretch of earth with a dark story and a few bad coincidences. But the ones who live closest, the ones who've lost something to it, know better. They know the truth Evelyn Buchanan left behind in her final message, scratched into the stone of that old mine. She is not gone. And neither is the thing that took her. It's still there. It's still hungry. And it's still waiting.